great and exciting news. I want to introduce our next major event coming up. The Myth Information Conference number 4 will be held on Saturday, September 30th. Reserve the date now. Tickets are not yet available, will be available soon. The final speaking roster is not completely scheduled, but we do have, for sure, Melissa Chen, Armored Skeptic, and Shoeonhead from YouTube, Tom and Cecil from the Cognitive Dissonance podcast, real funny guys. Other guests will include Arn Ra, Seth Andrews, Matt Dillahunty, and Allie Jackson, among others. The list isn't done yet, and the premiere of the homegrown Mythicist Milwaukee movie, Batman and Jesus, with our amazing director, Father Joseph. More details to come. Welcome to the Mythicist Milwaukee show, recorded January 8th of 2017, our first podcast of the new year, and a really exciting one. Our guest for today is Dr. Sean Carroll, a theoretical physicist at the California Institute of Technology, a prolific author in both peer-reviewed journals and books geared for people like me without the technical acumen to understand such journals. For those who aren't theoretical physicist, he's written books From Eternity to Here, The Particle at the End of the Universe, and his most recent book, The Big Picture. Sean has also been in a number of YouTube debates that I've watched, some against Dr. Eben Alexander and William Lane Craig. He's also been on Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. He's the absolute hero of my co-host. I want to say this. Hero of my co-host, Mario Quadracci, who's with me today.
Indeed.
Sean, do you have a debate that you like to watch, or a video of yourself that you rewatch? Do you have a favorite?
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness. No, I'm one of those people who just cannot possibly stand to watch myself or listen to myself or anything like that. So I'll tell you right now, guys, I'm not going to listen to this podcast. I'm going to trust you that you do a good job here, but I would rather do something completely different than look at myself.
Okay, good. We promise not to quote mine you and completely
Excellent.
Reverse this and email it to Frank Turek or William Lane Craig or somebody.
I'm in your hands.
We wanted to talk about your new book, and I know Mario is reading this. He's either finished it or reading it a second time, gearing through it. Mario, you had a question when you wanted to start, with specifically.
Yeah, it's a concept that runs through the book, and you introduce it early on, and it's that the idea of poetic naturalism. And I find this really interesting, and it's a huge concept. Would you mind just kind of laying out generally what you mean?
Sure. Poetic naturalism isn't anything novel and imaginative. It's just putting a label on a certain way of looking at things that some people have had. Naturalism is the idea that there's only one world, the natural world, the world that we investigate by doing science and learn about through empirical methods. And within naturalism, there's different attitudes you can have about what is real. And one attitude would be a very, very austere and minimalist one, that the only thing that is real is nature at its most fundamental, whatever that is, whether it's some quantum wave function or particles and fields or whatever you think is the fundamental essence of reality. And everything else is an illusion or not real. That includes baseballs and tables and chairs and consciousness and all those things. They're just illusions. On the other hand, there's a form of naturalism that is happy to add things to the natural world, even though they're not technically things, they're properties or rules or guidelines. So people who are moral realists, who think that there are objective moral truths out there, or people who think that there are mental properties in addition to physical properties, those would be augmented naturalists. And poetic naturalism is in between. It says that, tables and chairs and consciousness are all real, but they're not extra properties. They're just ways of talking about the underlying physical stuff. And so that can include everything from tables and chairs, also to free will and consciousness, and also to morality and ideas about right and wrong. These are all ways that we choose to talk about the one true reality.
So this is a way of saying you don't need to be a nihilist in order to be a naturalist.
Yeah, no, I don't think so at all. Having said that, I'm going to have dinner tomorrow night with Alex Rosenberg, one of my favorite nihilists. He's a philosopher at Duke who wrote a wonderful book called The Atheist Guide to Reality, where he advocates nice nihilism. So he is a hardcore reductionist naturalist, and that's great. We can all get together and debate what's real and what's an illusion.
So Sean, You do basically contend, though, that everything is built of this fundamental stuff. So in a way, everything is actually determined. Am I misreading you there?
Well, of course, we don't know for sure, since we don't know what the fundamental laws of physics are. My best estimate of what the fundamental laws of physics are going to turn out to be is something within the framework of the Everett or many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And there, the answer is yes. Everything is ultimately completely determined about the history of the universe. Of course, because it's quantum mechanics, the universe branches along the way, and we can't actually use that determinism to make reliable predictions about what is going to happen when we do a quantum mechanical experiment.
You mean on kind of a macroscopic level? So there's no way we could ever predict what someone was going to say next, or anything of that kind of complexity.
Well, no, this is something a little bit different. I mean, there's two questions. One is the question of principle, and one is the question of practice. Of course, in practice, you have to say not only is the underlying nature of reality predictable, but do I know it well enough to make predictions? And there, the answer is clearly no. And I don't suspect it's going to be yes anytime soon. And that's where chaos theory and sensitive dependence of initial conditions comes in. The question of principle is, can we imagine if we in principle had perfect knowledge and perfect calculational ability, then could we predict what was going to happen next? Could we be Laplace's demon?
Right.
And in the Everett view of quantum mechanics, the answer is yes, if the questions you're asking about are about the wave function of the whole universe. No, if the questions you're asking about are of the form, what is one particular person going to see? Because there's always quantum mechanical uncertainty that you just can't get rid of.
Sure. Can you flesh that out just a little bit more?
Well, in Everett, he takes advantage of the following thing. If you believe in quantum mechanics at all, then you believe that things that we observe in the world can be in superpositions, in particular superpositions of potential observable outcomes. So if you have an electron that has spin, as all electrons do, then it could be, let's say, spinning clockwise or spinning counterclockwise. But in quantum mechanics, it can be in a superposition. It doesn't need to be all one or all the other. And it's not until you measure it that it becomes completely spinning clockwise or counterclockwise. So Everett, and everyone who believes in quantum mechanics believes in that. And Everett says, if you believe that electrons can be in superpositions, then you should be able to believe that people who measure the spin of electrons can be in superpositions. One can be in a superposition of having measured the electron spinning clockwise and having measured the electron spinning counterclockwise. If you believe that, you should believe the whole universe can be in a superposition, potentially of very different experimental outcomes. So there's many worlds built into the structure of quantum mechanics.
The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, I mean, for the layman like me that knows what that is, that you can't predict the position of an electron, they kind of exist as clouds. Could you say that's the reason that you would never have a Laplace's demon, because you can't predict where that electron is, so therefore there's certain randomness? Is that a fair argument?
Basically it. I mean, the point is that in quantum mechanics, there is no such thing, really, deep down, as the position of the electron or the velocity of the electron. Those are things you can measure, but until you measure them, they don't exist. That's the weirdness of quantum mechanics. And the uncertainty principle says that if you choose to measure them, if you don't tell me ahead of time what you're going to measure, there is going to be always some uncertainty in the experimental outcome. You can arrange an electron so that there is no uncertainty if you were to measure its position, but then there'd be infinite uncertainty if you measured its velocity, and vice versa. And so you can sort of minimize both, but there will always be some uncertainty there. So yeah, going through life, wave functions branch, and we don't know what's going to happen exactly next. So the life of any one particular person in the universe is one that cannot be completely predicted.
So with this kind of fundamental understanding of reality, how do we then map this onto ideas like consciousness or free will, that type of thing?
Right. Well, those are the two big ones. Life used to be a big one, right? People worried that life could not be explained by ordinary physical phenomena, but that's more or less gone away, unless you're even Alexander. But consciousness and free will are slightly different problems. Free will, there's a big question of what you mean, what your definition is. And honestly, there's again, some people, obviously, I was joking about even Alexander being the only person who believes that life is not purely physical. Most people here on Earth do not believe that life is purely physical, right? They believe that there's an afterlife and the whole business. So most people here on Earth probably believe in what we call libertarian free will, that even in principle, the laws of physics do not determine what I'm going to do. Even up to the uncertainties of quantum mechanics, I, as a human agent, still have the ability to overcome the laws of physics. So let's put aside that. We can argue that that's not true. There's good reasons to think that's not true. Okay. But if you buy that we are just the laws of physics, that we are made of physical stuff doing physical things, there's still huge, incredibly boring debates about definitions, which I just don't have that much interest in. So my first move whenever someone seems to want to debate about free will is to try to get them to agree to not use the phrase free will in whatever debate we're having. If we can't do that, then we realize that the only disagreement is about the phrase free will, not about any physical phenomenon.
What's a better definition? What do you like to use in lieu of free will?
Well, just let's talk about what actually happens. What actually happens is human beings obey the laws of physics. They don't have any soul that is an immaterial thing that is pushing them around over and above what the laws of physics say. But they're emergent phenomena. Human beings are not part of the most fundamental description of nature. They're not there in the wave function of the universe a priori. They're a way of talking. So we have our best way of talking about human beings. We have the theory of human beings, just like we have the theory of baseballs or of thermodynamics or whatever. And we use that theory every time we talk about human beings, like when we say that someone is tall or irritable or annoying or brilliant. These are kinds of features that a person might have in the best way we have about talking about human beings. And part of that best way we have about talking is that people make choices. Like, you can't go through the day talking about human beings in a vocabulary that doesn't let you talk about what choices they're going to make, what they should do, things like that. I mean, the most fervent free will denier will make sentences like, we should not talk about free will. And you have to say, well, what does he mean? I'm just going to do what the laws of physics tell me to do. You can't tell me what I should do, I shouldn't do. So I don't think it's internally consistent to take that point of view. If you're going to talk about human beings at all, you're going to talk about them making choices, and that's what I mean by free will.
Okay, so this is really just semantics at this point. I mean, yes, everything's determined, but we just can't make sense of our reality as human beings without invoking these concepts.
Well, it's not just semantics. It's those are two very, very important statements that are both simultaneously true.
No, I really like your analogy on emergent properties, like things like baseball is emergent. That there was nothing about the universe that baseball should exist, and some other sport that we don't know of doesn't exist. At what point do you say the emergent properties start? Like, it's certainly probably not at the quantum level. Is it at the biological level, or is it like at the mammalian consciousness level? At what point do you start calling them emergent?
I think we start using emergent vocabulary very, very deep down. Atoms are emergent, for example. They're not part of the standard model of particle physics. You can predict their existence using the standard model of particle physics, but the standard model has things like electrons and neutrinos and protons. It doesn't even have protons, it has quarks and gluons, right? Mm-hmm. So anything that is a collection of more fundamental things is an emergent property. Mm. And particle physicists use this all the time. We have what are called effective field theories. So when you talk about protons and neutrons, we have no trouble talking about protons and neutrons as if they were elementary particles, but we know they're really not. They're made of quarks and gluons. That's an emergent feature of the standard model of particle physics. So unless you are talking about the absolute most fundamental, basic, deep down layer of reality, absolutely everything else you talk about is emergent.
Let's talk about that fundamental level of reality. Is, to the best of your understanding, this quantum wave function?
That's right. That is the best of our current understanding about what the fundamental level really looks like.
Can you describe it? And I'm having a hard time conceptualizing it. Should we look at this as kind of like a scaffolding on which reality is built, or is it a seed bed through which everything kind of emerges? Or how do you look at the quantum wave function practically?
Well, it is reality. That's what reality is. There's something called reality. Whatever it is, our current best theoretical understanding of reality is that it has the features of a quantum wave function. So reality is just reality. Like, it's not made of anything else, then that wouldn't be the most fundamental level of reality, right? Mm-hmm. Everything else is made of reality. So, people want to know, like, well, why is it like that? What is it? What is the more deep level and things like that? But reality is what reality is, and all we do as scientists is try to come up with the best formal structure for describing it. And right now, our best formal structure is this thing called a vector in Hilbert space. That's what quantum mechanics people would call the quantum wave function, the quantum state of the universe. So there's a little bit of mathematical structure there that lets us tell us what we can do. And almost everything, as I guess it was Democritus said long ago, everything is by convention except for atoms and the void. So right now we say that everything is by convention other than the quantum wave function of the universe.
Interesting. Moving on just a little bit, and this kind of goes to some of the more popular debates that you've had with Christian apologists like William Lane Craig, but it's also part of your book. I wonder if you could get into like the cosmological argument that's often used for the existence of God and why it kind of fails, and why that's important to this book about how we describe reality.
Yeah, so the cosmological argument has different forms. William Lane Craig's favorite form, the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a little bit different from time to time. Mm-hmm. He changes it without necessarily posting an update, but the rough idea is that everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Mm-hmm. Sometimes words like transcendent appear in there and so forth. But, I think every single one of the statements in the syllogism is incorrect. So I don't think it's a very persuasive argument. There's an enormous amount of effort extended on the question, did the universe have a beginning? I just gave a talk a couple days ago at the American Astronomical Society meeting that talked about the very real possibility that the universe did not have a beginning. We don't know what happened at the beginning of the universe. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But in neither case is it true that we need a cause to explain it. So given that we don't know whether the universe had a beginning or not, I kind of don't really care about that one. Even if it's true the universe had a beginning, the argument still doesn't work, because the idea that things that have beginnings have causes is just woefully inadequate way of thinking when you think about the universe as a whole. Things like causes are, guess what? Emergent phenomena within the universe. Mm-hmm. Causes are nowhere to be found in the standard model of particle physics or the core theory, if you add gravity in there, or anything we know about the most fundamental layer of reality. Causes are not things that are there. They're useful ways of talking at a much more macroscopic level.
So there goes premise one, right? It fails from the get-go.
That's why in my debate with him, I said it's not even wrong. It's just a misplaced set of words next to each other that don't really fit together from the perspective of modern science.
And it seems like you've challenged him to defend a model of the universe that is eternal, because you said they do exist, but he never kind of defends a model, and that a model needs to be predictive. I mean, if your theory isn't predictive, it's kind of not worth having. Is that right?
Well, it's a complicated question in the philosophy of science. What I tried to make the point, where he did not really engage me, was that if we're really talking about models of cosmology, of the universe, of why it's here and so forth, then when we do science, not only do we collect data and see if our theory fits the data, but we give points to our theories for standing up for something, for saying that some things are true and some things are not true. And the most down-to-earth way that can happen is by making an absolutely unwriggle-outable prediction for something. Mm-hmm. But there's other ways it can happen also, because the idea of the down nuts and bolts working of empiricism is actually pretty subtle and complicated. But theism fails just because it says almost nothing. It says literally nothing that we don't already know, right? I mean, no one has ever used theism to predict the mass of the dark matter particle or anything like that. People have used the anthropic principle in the multiverse to predict the mass of the dark matter particle, but theism can't even try to do something like that because it's just too ill-defined. Mm-hmm. And when I say that, theists sometimes say, no, the idea of God is perfectly well-defined. He's a perfect necessary being. But theism is more than just some feel-good words about God. It also has to be a connection between that little motto and how God actually behaves. And there, the connection is almost completely flexible. You can make anything that can happen in the universe, you go, oh yes, that's just what God would have done.
Right. You mentioned that Craig's like best argument is the teleological argument, rather than like the other. And why do you think it's the best argument to go with?
Well, I think it plays by the rules of empiricism. The teleological argument, I'm not sure why they're calling it that, but it's more like the argument from design, the argument from fine-tuning, the good old natural theology strategy of looking at the world and noticing that there are certain features of the world that are better explained by theism than by naturalism. And, I think that the big problem with that is, like we just said, theism is so ill-defined that it doesn't explain much at all. But it is the best argument because at least it is comparing two different models, theism and naturalism, and then going out and looking at the world. It's a good empirical argument rather than an a priori argument. Whenever someone tries to prove something about the world as it is by speaking in syllogisms, they're tricking you. The conclusions are only going to be as true as the premises, and you got to establish some reason to believe in those premises. And the only good reason we have for establishing such things is by going out and looking at the world. So that's why empiricism has been enormously successful.
Can you run us through just quickly what is meant by fine-tuning as you would use it as a cosmologist or physicist?
Yeah, many different things, sadly. So particle physicists and physicists more broadly do have a way of using the phrase fine-tuning that is very, as you would guess, very technical and specific, and they know what they mean. What they mean is that there's some number in the theory, like the mass of the electron or the strength of the electromagnetic force, and that this number is somehow unnatural. It's not what you would have guessed. More specifically, if you sort of there's a long song and dance we don't have to go into, but if you started with a classical theory and quantized it, the number wouldn't change very much once you quantized your theory. So something like the mass of the Higgs boson, which we've measured now, it's 125 times the mass of the electron. So it turns out that's very fine-tuned. If you started with that number and calculated the corrections to it due to quantum mechanics, they're huge. So the Higgs boson should be much, much heavier than it should be. So that's what fine-tuning means to a physicist. The number doesn't take on the value that you would naturally expect it to. The theist, when talking about fine-tuning, usually means fine-tuning for the existence of life or the intelligent life or something like that. And that, particle physicists couldn't care less about intelligent life. They all want to know about particles. But of course, since we know next to nothing about what life is or the conditions under which it would be realistic for it to appear, that's a much harder argument to make. There's probably some very hard to wriggle out of conditions for life to exist. Like you want more than one particle in the universe, right? Other than that, you're not going to get life existing. But people try to get very, very, very specific. Like if there weren't as many earthquakes on Earth as we get, then life would not have evolved in the right way. And that kind of argument, I think, is just you already know what conclusion you're going to get. You're just trying to figure out new ways to pile on to make it seem like you're going to get there.
Right. And by life, they seem to mean biological life, right? Because they're also asserting that life exists in a different realm, like heaven or hell or some other spirit plane, which is yet undefined. So it seems like, why biological life? Because you could still have your spirit life without it.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the argument for theism based on fine-tuning of physical parameters is self-undermining, because what they're actually arguing is that the laws of physics are fine-tuned to allow for naturalist life to appear, the life obeying the laws of physics. If you're a theist, then typically you don't think that's what life is. You think that there's more to life than just the right kind of chemical reactions coming together. So if anything, it's evidence for naturalism, the fact that the world is finely tuned to allow purely physical mechanisms to come together to make something like a biological organism.
Where does the term fine-tuning come from? Because it does seem to imply some sort of agency, someone who's twiddling the knobs or what have you.
Well, it might imply that, but that's, because there's different realms of conversation about these things. When physicists talk about fine-tuning, the idea that they're somehow invoking someone tuning the knobs or a deity or anything like that doesn't even enter their minds. So they don't mind using vocabulary that to another person might be reminiscent of that kind of idea because they're completely blind to that. So, they just don't have that in mind whatsoever. I'm not sure where the phrase first started getting used, but it's just important to know that it means different things to different people.
It seems like Boltzmann brains came up. I've listened to William Lane Craig a while, but I hadn't heard him talk about Boltzmann brains until your debate with him. And I can't figure out exactly what they are. And it feels like this was an argument to confuse me. Can you explain what a Boltzmann brain is and why that isn't a good argument?
Yeah, the Boltzmann brain argument was brought up by Craig as an argument against the idea of the cosmological multiverse. If you do think that you look at the world and it seems fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life, but you don't want to give credit to a theistic designer, one very easy way out is just to say, look, there's many, many different conditions in the universe in different places, and some of those conditions are going to allow for life and some are not. So you shouldn't be surprised that we're here in a place where the conditions do allow for the existence of life. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good argument for, you don't need God. There's a very straightforward physical way of getting as much fine-tuning as life requires. What he tried to do was to put a counter-argument to that by saying that most or all multiverse theories are ruled out by the existence of Boltzmann brains. The idea here is that if you live in a universe that is randomly fluctuating, that it's just empty space, but there's small quantum mechanical or thermal fluctuations now and again, then if that universe lasts forever, or almost forever anyway, then these random fluctuations are going to team up now and again to give you all sorts of crazy things. They will give you random, kittens appearing in empty space just as a random fluctuation, or solar systems or galaxies or the whole universe could appear if you wait long enough. So that's bad for many reasons. I'm finishing up an article right now on why that's bad. It's bad because you, sitting in your room with your thoughts and your hopes and dreams, in that universe are overwhelmingly likely to have just randomly fluctuated into existence. And all of your opinions and beliefs about the outside world have no correlation with what the outside world is really like. So that's another self-undermining point of view on the universe, because you can't believe that it's true and think that you have a good reason to believe that it's true at the same time. So if Boltzmann brains did dominate the universe, if most people like you and me were random fluctuations, not ordinary observers that came into existence in a reliable way, then that indeed would undermine your belief. You wouldn't have any good reason to believe that cosmological model. Of course, many cosmological models don't have Boltzmann brains, even though they have a multiverse. The existence of Boltzmann brains is much less common than he seemed to believe it was. And I made that point, and he didn't respond to it, as far as I could tell.
The other thing, he's always very critical of the idea of a multiverse and likens it to just a completely ad hoc concept. Or, I've heard other apologists say it takes total faith to believe in the multiverse. But that's not true, is it? It is indicated by mathematics.
Well, I mean, it's completely disingenuous to think that it takes faith or a leap of imagination to believe in the multiverse. Mm-hmm. People talked about multiverses for hundreds and hundreds of years, but cosmologists did not start taking them seriously until they realized that the multiverse is predicted by other theories that we like for completely other reasons. Theories like string theory and inflationary cosmology. That doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that it's out there. We don't have direct evidence, that's for sure, that there is a multiverse out there. But we didn't make it up just to wriggle out of some problems. It was kind of forced on us by taking seriously a set of theories that we like for other reasons.
Right, a modern theory. And I like you kind of defend theism in a way as if we were living 2,000 years ago, a lot of us would have been forced to assume a God because the amount of evidence we had would have suggested something like that. The multiverse was suggested by the evidence, not just created.
I think that, as time goes on, as we learn more and collect more data, our best theories of how the world works change. Even 500 years ago, I think our best theories of the world would reasonably have been said to include God as part of them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things we couldn't explain otherwise. Now we can do better.
Is the multiverse falsifiable? Is it testable? Is there any way we could ever have any kind of direct evidence of it?
Well, it's testable because it might not be as testable as we would like, but certainly there are things that could happen in the history of physics and cosmology that would lead us to give up on the multiverse idea. Mm-hmm. One is that we could, the problem really is that the theories that are competing with each other, even on the physics side, forget about theism, but they're not that well developed yet. They don't make very specific claims about what's happening. So you can believe in the vague idea of string theory in the multiverse. In principle, that should make predictions, at least statistical predictions, for what are the most likely values that you should observe for things like the mass of the Higgs boson, the vacuum energy, the mass of the electron, and so forth. So in principle, that's very doable. In practice, we are nowhere close to being capable of doing that because we just don't have the theory yet that is well developed enough to do that. So it's just premature to demand that these theories make those predictions. We're working toward it. And it's completely fair if you want to say, well, because these theories are not well developed, I'm going to put a very low credence that they're true. Mm-hmm. That's completely fair if that's what you want to do. But you can't say that it's like against the spirit of science to try to develop this theory that we just haven't developed yet.
Bayesian reasoning and credences plays a big part in the book. Can you, just for our listeners, kind of run down how that's useful and just kind of how that works?
Sure. Bayes' theorem is a theorem that was put forward by Reverend Thomas Bayes, a Presbyterian minister several hundred years ago. And he was a funny guy, actually. He wrote two sort of scholarly books. One was a defense of calculus. After, it was a time when calculus was like the very controversial topic like the multiverse is today. So he defended calculus. But the other one was about probability. And basically, it's a codification of a certain element of common sense. But it's a way of looking at what probability is that can be very, very influential and helpful. And so what a Bayesian says is you have a set of possible things that can be true, a set of propositions about the universe. And let's say that they're exclusive, so maybe the propositions are theism is true or theism is not true. Okay, one of those is correct. And what the Bayesian says is to each of these propositions, you assign a prior credence. Even before you know anything about the world, you say, well, if I didn't know anything, what I would say is more likely than not. Maybe I say that theism is more beautiful, therefore it has an 80% chance, or maybe I say that naturalism or non-theism is simpler because it only has one thing, not two things, so I give that up. It doesn't matter. You get to choose your priors. And then he says, then you collect information, and you update your priors on the basis of new information, basically by multiplying them by what's called a likelihood. Given this proposition, theism or not theism, how likely was it that this particular piece of data would come along? Like I see Jesus' face on a tortilla or something like that. Every piece of information you get has a certain likelihood in your two theories. And if your two theories have different likelihoods for that piece of information, then you're going to change your credences. If something very likely happens in one theory that's unlikely in another one, and you observe that thing to happen, that's going to push your credences toward one and away from the other.
You use it to great effect with the problem of evil in the book. Can you run through that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of consequences of Bayesian reasoning. One is that if I'm not exactly trying to put this in a small amount of words. If there's something that had you observed it, your credence in a theory would go up. Then the fact that if you don't observe it, your credence necessarily goes down. Mm-hmm. You don't have a choice. Right? There's no option there. So people talk about the problem of evil, which is, there's a lot of evil in the world. I think that God would not have created evil. Therefore, this is evidence against God. This is a good argument, right? And it's very Bayesian. It's saying, okay, I have some credence for God's existence. I make a prediction. I say that it's likely with the existence of God that there's no evil. It's unlikely that there is evil. I go out and observe there is evil. That decreases my credence in the existence of God. Of course, then other people want to argue against that. They want to say, well, I can imagine all sorts of reasons why God would have wanted to let evil appear in the world. And this is part of the problem with theism being very ill-defined, right? You can always make a reason why a feature of the world would be compatible with theism because it's so ill-defined. So the way that I like to make the argument is, imagine a world where there wasn't evil. Imagine a world where it was actually true that your naive expectation of what God would do had come true, right? There's like accidents always favored people who really deserved good fortune. The world was completely fair. People were nice to each other. Ask yourself, would you take that as evidence for the existence of God? Of course you would. All else being equal, that seems more likely to happen if God exists than if you're in a randomly fluctuating universe that obeys impersonal laws of physics. So therefore, if you think that the absence of evil would count as evidence for God, you cannot help, just by math and logic, no way to wriggle out, you cannot help but thinking that the existence of evil in the world should decrease the probability that God exists.
Or unless it's an evil God, right?
That's right. But,
Right.
Then you shouldn't have thought that the absence of evil was evidence for it.
It seems like, too, that evil, like art, is subjective. I mean, if you read of why ISIS is doing the things that they're doing, that they're saying they're essentially doing it out of love. That, the fact that you're not worshiping Allah in the same way that they do is evil. It's actually worse than, the things that they're doing. So it seems like
the good thing about being a scientist and a naturalist is I do not need to worry about doctrinal differences between different flavors of theism. So I like my theory. I think that my theory works better than other people's theories, and I have good reason to believe it. So, I'm much less interested in bashing people who disagree with me than just putting forward the best case I can for the positive view of the world that poetic naturalism provides.
And that seems to be kind of the underlying motivation of the book. Is that it? Just to kind of lay out your view of reality and the best way to kind of understand it and talk about it?
Yeah, I think that there's basically two messages to the book. One is that naturalism is true, and the other is that that's okay. It's not a reason for existential despair or a lack of ability to have meaning or purpose in our lives.
Purpose, and a lot of most theists talk about purpose with a capital P, that it's something that's instilled into the universe or instilled into us by a purpose maker. How can we have purpose without that being true?
Yeah, well, we do. There's just like free will and making choices. A friend of mine, Scott Derrickson, he's also the director of Doctor Strange, the movie, and he's a committed evangelical Christian. And but we have fun. He put it better than any naturalist I know of. He said, you can't possibly believe the universe doesn't have purposes because I'm part of the universe and I have purposes. There you go. That's it, right? Sometimes my purpose is to make the cup of coffee in the morning. Sometimes my purpose is to help raise a child in a good way. But I don't. It's just like the argument that without God's existence, love wouldn't be real. It's like I'm in love with a person and I'm not a theist, and therefore you're telling me that I'm making a mistake somehow or lying to myself. It just doesn't make sense. If I have a purpose, if I have something that I want to do, something I want to accomplish, a goal. And it doesn't matter to me that goal is put there by some contingent features of the laws of physics and biological evolution and my upbringing, whatever. It's there. That's what matters.
And I think a lot of theists would argue, though, that yes, you have those things, but it's because theism is true. On a naturalistic model, we can't account for the laws of logic, for love, those types of things. How would you respond to that?
Well, again, I think that there's an issue. There's many issues here. One is what kinds of explanation you imagine the world can possibly owe us. As a scientist, you want to describe what happens in the world. You want to say this happens, this doesn't happen. Here's the pattern that it happens. Very often, that kind of explanation helps us with questions of the form, well, why is it like that, right? Why is it that electrical charge is conserved? Oh, it's because there's a symmetry underlying the forces of the standard model of particle physics. So sometimes there are answers to those questions. But then you ask questions like, well, why is there that symmetry? And, ultimately, like the 8-year-old asking a whole bunch of why questions, you're going to hit the bottom and say, well, that's just the way it is. You don't get to demand that there is a reason why there are laws of logic or why the universe exists or things like that. At some point, you just say, well, that's just the way it is. And that's okay. Once again, that's the second lesson of the book. That's okay. We don't have the right to demand certain kinds of explanations or answers from the structure of the universe itself.
Do you think that a lot of the theists that argue against you are making the same mistake that Dr. Alexander started with the quote in his book when he said, Einstein said, we shouldn't be looking for things that should be, we should be looking for how things are. Do you feel like they're constantly just looking for things that ought to be?
Well, I think it's complicated. And again, my interest in psychoanalyzing people I disagree with is very, very low. Okay. I think that the way that I would put it is that it's perfectly obvious that as human beings, we are not perfectly rational. Okay, we have all sorts of cognitive biases. We have wishful thinking. We have, pattern recognition. There's a million things that we have, and therefore, whenever we are trying to reach correct conclusions about how the world works, we should be on guard for our own cognitive biases. And if you say out loud that I want something to be true, that's not an argument that thing is true. That's an argument you should be skeptical about that thing being true, because you are admitting you have a cognitive bias in favor of finding evidence for this thing. And that's absolutely just as true for atheists and naturalists as it is for theists. I mean, I would say that people who want to find objective moral truths are being misled by that particular bias because they want them to be there. Steven Weinberg, who is an absolute hero of mine, one of the great physicists alive today, admits that one of the reasons he doesn't like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is because he doesn't want there to be a lot of worlds. I think that's not an argument. That's something we need to guard against. And I totally admit that I need to do that too. And I try. That's all we can ever do.
In the book, emergence is obviously a concept that's really important. And you talk about maybe time being an emergent property of quantum mechanics. What would that mean? If that's true, what would that mean to speak of a beginning of the universe? Right.
That's complicated, but we'll give it a shot here. Okay, so remember quantum mechanics? 20 minutes ago, we said that quantum mechanics has this feature called superpositions, right? You can take different things that you would observe about the world, and a quantum state could add them all together in one big superposition. They don't mush together. They're sort of separate parts of that quantum wave function. So if time is real and fundamental and essential, then what we have is, as the universe, is some state of the universe evolving with time. Here's the universe at 12 o'clock. Here's the universe at 12:01, 12:02, etc. But what you can imagine doing is creating a separate quantum state, imagine a different universe, which is the following thing. Take what the universe was doing at 12 o'clock, take that quantum state, take what the universe is doing at 12:01, and add them together in a superposition. And then add the universe at 12:02 and 12:03 and add them all together in some huge number of different parts of the wave function, and just add them all together. What you get is a single wave function that is not evolving in time, because by construction you said that's what it is, that's all that there is, but with the feature that every different part of that wave function looks like a universe that has been evolving and will continue to evolve in time. So in that kind of setup, time is emergent. It is a useful approximation. You might as well think of time as connecting all of these different branches of the wave function of the universe. But it's not fundamental. It's something we need to sort of dig out, and it's a way of talking about the universe that is convenient to us.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, so if the current theory of the universe that I understand is that the acceleration of the universe is continually expanding. So we're not going for a big crunch, we're going for some kind of big freeze. Right. What if that weren't true? If we were going for a big crunch, would time travel so entropy is increasing or decreasing, would time reverse?
Well, there's no reason to think entropy would decrease if the universe crunched. It is a fact of our actual universe that when the universe was small, the entropy was low. But that's not a necessary connection. That's just a contingent feature of how we actually live. What we'd expect is if the universe recollapsed, even while it's recollapsing, entropy would still start going up. So time would not reverse.
Okay.
Oh, that's interesting.
That is fair. That one was bugging me. What, do you know? Here's another one. I'm a big fan of sci-fi, and I just thought I'd throw it out to you off topic. Like, is the sci-fi, assertion of wormholes or the notion of wormholes, does that have any basis in reality of what a wormhole would actually look like to a cosmologist?
Yeah, the wormhole in Interstellar was pretty accurate. My friend Kip Thorne from Caltech was the science advisor and executive producer on the movie, and he did his best. It wasn't completely accurate because, honestly, there's no reason for it to take any time to travel through a wormhole. A wormhole would kind of look like a portal, right? Mm-hmm. It would look like you look in one end and it's a mirror to somewhere a window rather, to some part of the universe that is very, very far away. But it's a 360-degree mirror. Like, no matter which direction you look at it from, you see something very far away. There's no reason to think that these things exist in the real world. We could talk about them according to the laws of physics that we know about, but we don't have any theory that says they're probably there. So I wouldn't get all that excited.
You've done some advising for TV and film as well. What kind of projects have you worked on?
I've worked on a bunch of little things. Tron Legacy, the sequel to Tron, I worked on. The Thor movies, Thor 1 and Thor 2.
So Asgard is scientifically sound?
Well, no, but that's the thing. As a science advisor, your job is not to make sure that everything in the movie is scientifically sound. Your job is to make the world seem realistic in its own right. Okay. Right? Yeah. So this is a world where Asgard exists. That's the given. So given that, and given the fact that they look like human beings and all these other million crazy things, make it make logical sense. So the way to think about science advising is the plot of the movie is data. It's not theory. It's your job as a science advisor to come up with a theory that somehow accounts for that data.
So if you were advising then, like on, say, Terminator, what do you share like Elon Musk's fear that AI could be the ultimate end of us? Or would you have given them different advice?
Well, I think that AI, much like extraterrestrial intelligence, but much more realistically, AI is one of these things. There's obviously huge good things that can come out of it. If we're at all honest, there's also very bad things that could potentially come out of it. So it, to me, obviously makes sense to be very, very cautious, to think through the worst case scenarios, not to just sort of say, well, I think everything will probably be okay, right? I'm very much in favor of worst case scenarios as something we take very seriously, whether it's extraterrestrials or artificial intelligence or giant solar flares or asteroids hitting or anything like that. I would like to at least prepare for the worst.
I suppose you could throw climate change in there too. Maybe the conservative argument for this.
Unlikely rare thing. Climate change is going to happen. So that's just, that's the future.
Are you as alarmed as, say, Stephen Hawking about AI, thinking it's a real present existential threat to humanity?
I suspect, and maybe this is a little bit unfair. By the way, happy birthday, Stephen. This is his 75th birthday.
Happy birthday, Stephen.
Happy birthday.
75 is kind of amazing.
That is amazing.
Age to reach.
Which they gave him, 2 years to live when he was diagnosed with AI?
Yeah, he should have been dead by 30. And he's still writing physics papers.
Wow.
So I suspect that maybe he's trying to scare us. I think that he thinks that people don't want to take the dangers very seriously, and therefore the right strategy for him is to be as alarmist as he can be to shake people up a little.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if what he's saying is the most accurate view of his actual Bayesian credences about the dangers of AI. It could be. I don't know. But I completely agree that people should be shaken up a little bit, so I wouldn't blame him if that's what was going on.
Sure.
Yeah, perhaps he's giving us a little tough love there.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's okay. We can use that.
Just quickly getting back to the book for maybe one last topic. Let's can you explain how we were talking about entropy earlier and how that relates to complexity and kind of where we are in the evolution of the universe in entropic terms?
Yeah, this is a great point. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, actually, because people have this informal idea that if things are complex, they must be very, very low entropy, because entropy is like disorder and complexity requires order. And therefore, even if there's not, strictly speaking, a contradiction, it still seems weird that over the course of the evolution of the universe, from low entropy order to high entropy disorder, organized things like you and me, living beings, would come into existence. So part of what I try to do in the book is to point out that there's just it's not at all true that high complexity means low entropy. These are separate categories. And in fact, as the universe expands and cools, entropy just goes up. But complexity first goes up and then goes down. In fact, when things are very, very, very low entropy, things are almost guaranteed to be simple. Because complexity versus simplicity is a matter of how much information do I need to give you to describe what's going on. So if everything is low entropy, if the cream and the coffee are not mixed together, or if all the atoms of some perfume are bottled up in a little perfume bottle, that's a very simple configuration. I just described the whole thing, right? I didn't need a lot of details. Whereas high entropy, equilibrium, where everything is mixed together, that's also very simple. Everything is mixed together. It's in between when entropy is increasing, where the different pieces are coming together in different ways on different scales and things look turbulent and fractal. That's when complexity arises. So the most natural thing in the world, exactly what you would expect, is to live in a world where things started out simple, became complex later. That's the good news. The bad news is the complexity will go away eventually, and our universe will sort of fizzle out.
Kind of like food dye being, put into water, and as it changes from complete water, to the mixing process, and then completely red or whatever it is. I think
that's right. It looks complex, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in between.
So, would the existence of extraterrestrial life would that hurt the Boltzmann brain argument then? That we show that this is more common? Because I think the argument almost assumes that this is unique.
Well, no. It actually makes no difference whatsoever to the Boltzmann brain argument because the numbers are so huge. What matters to the Boltzmann brain argument is basically two things. One, can you make Boltzmann brains at all? And number two, how long does the universe last for? So it's possible that our universe won't last for much longer, or at least not in the stage that it's in now. It could decay into some other kind of universe where there would be no chance of making Boltzmann brains. And so in a short-lived universe, it doesn't really matter how easy it is to make Boltzmann brains. You will almost always have the case where ordinary observers like you and me are much more common. In an old universe, if Boltzmann brains can exist at all, then they will always win. It doesn't matter how many. Like, literally, if there were 1 trillion intelligent beings, forget about 1 trillion, 1 trillion intelligent beings on every planet around every star in the observable universe. If we live in a universe that will eventually empty out and start making Boltzmann brains, there's many, 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 many more Boltzmann brains.
Okay.
What are the leading kind of cosmological theories at the moment? And which one, if you were a betting man, would you put your money on?
I don't know. I'm not going to even bet. I used to have stronger feelings than I have now. We have a wonderful, extremely predictive and rigorous theory of what the universe has been doing in between 1 minute after the Big Bang and today. 13.8 billion years later. So that's pretty good. Like, we have to give ourselves a little pat on the back for putting that model together.
Absolutely.
It's called Lambda CDM. Lambda for the cosmological constant, the energy in empty space, CDM for cold dark matter. We can explain what the universe was doing, how fast it was expanding, the growth of structure, the dynamics of galaxies, the whole bit. But both before 1 minute and after today, we have much less to say. So we don't know whether there is a multiverse out there. We don't know whether the Big Bang was the beginning or whether there was something before the Big Bang. We don't know if our universe will last forever or whether it will change somehow very dramatically. All of these things are things we're thinking about as hard as we can, but it would be very, very premature to say we know any of those answers.
Do you think there's, like Dr. Penrose's CCC theory, do you think there's any, it's a pretty novel theory, do you think there's any credence to that?
I think it's very, very low for me because it doesn't explain the arrow of time at all. He has an arrow of time that is built in forever, infinity years, which in my mind requires an infinite amount of fine-tuning in the far, far past of the universe. I think that the single biggest goal that cosmologists who think about theories like this should have in mind is the attempt to explain why, in a natural way, entropy was lower in the past. And I don't think that his model does that.
You were obviously a prolific author. Do you have a preference or what fuels you on writing books for us, like The Big Picture, versus writing your articles? So, I mean, what do you like getting at the why are we here question as much as, digging into quantum wave theory?
Yeah, I like all of it. This is the flaw in my life, is that I would not be happy if I were doing one thing but not many other things at once. So that can be tough because I like doing many things, therefore I run out of time to do all of them. But I'm going to keep trying to do my best until I run out of time myself.
And it seems like you're good at so many things. Is there anything you really suck at? Are you like a bad bowler or anything?
There's so many things that I really suck at. Yeah, I guess the most heartbreaking, well, there's two heartbreaking things that I really suck at. One is foreign languages. It was never any good. And the other is playing a musical instrument. I would really love to be able to do that, but it just doesn't work for me.
All right, that makes me feel a little better.
Well, yeah, you got two sports there. I mean, it's hard to be in the MLB and NFL. It sounds like
there's many things. Yeah, I'm not. There's certain things that are kind of perfectly obvious things that I'm not very good at. So I'm not even going to start listing those.
But the book, the scope of that book is unreal. I mean, did you just one morning just say, I'm going to write a book about everything?
Well, it's the kind of thing that percolated in the back of my mind for years and years and years before I finally had the chance to do it. In fact, I remember the editor who I now work with at Dutton, Stephen Morrow, who's a wonderful guy who's edited all my books. Long before he was at Dutton, he came into my office when I was at the University of Chicago, and he was looking for people to write popular physics books. And so he knocked on my door, and we chatted for a while. And I said, well, I would be interested in someday writing a popular book, but I don't want to write a book about physics right now. I want to write a book about why God doesn't exist. And he was intrigued by that, and he took it back to his publishing house, and they said no one would ever buy that book. And then, of course, 2 years later, Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion and made $1 million. So it's hard to predict these things. But then again, I suspect that the book I would have written 15 years ago is not as good as the one I actually did write this year. So maybe it worked out for the best.
Oh, awesome.
Did you have a life-changing event, like as a kid, that put you on your career path? Did you have some kind of a transformation moment, or just something where I've got to get into physics?
No. I smoothly evolved into it from when I was a kid. When I was 10 years old, just reading books about the universe and about quarks and leptons and the Big Bang and black holes, and said, I want to do this, whatever that means.
Wow, so there was no first cause to that either.
No, you see, it just sort of happened, just like the universe.
Oh, I was just going to say, just thank you for your time. We've hit an hour mark. Don't want to keep you any longer than we have to, even though I could talk to you for eternity.
Awesome talking to you. I've watched a ton of your debates. I was surprised and a little embarrassed to not know who you were prior to about 3 weeks ago, and I'm really glad that I got to meet you. So.
Yes.
Well, now that I'm on the podcast, finally everyone will know. So that makes it so.
It's been a distinct pleasure for me. Thank you.
Yes, even Stephen Hawking, who is one of our avid listeners.
Excellent. Very good. Glad it'll catch up.
All right. Very good.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Thanks. And now over to Antonio with our myth of the day. Take it away, Antonio.
Thank you. And this is our myth of the day. Usul, equivalent to Helios, was the Christian Etruscan god of the sun. His name appears on the bronze liver Piacenza, next to Tiver, the moon, sun god. Frequently, Usul is seen running, walking on water. Helios was the personification of the sun god in Greek mythology. As time passed, Helio was increasingly identified with the god of light, Apollo. However, in spite of their syncretism, they were often also viewed as two distinct gods. Helios was a Titan, where Apollo was an Olympian. The equivalent of Usul in Roman mythology was Sol, specifically Sol Invictus. Etruscan civilization is the modern name given to a civilization of ancient Italy in the area corresponding roughly to Tuscany, western Umbria, and northern Latium. Their Roman name is the origin of the terms Tuscany, which refers to their heartland, and Etruria, which can refer to their wider region. This civilization endured from the time of the earliest Etruscan inscriptions around 700 BC until its assimilation into the Roman Republic in the late 4th century BC. And that is our myth of the day.
Thank you for your patronage of the Mythicist Milwaukee show. Also, take a look at our Holy Shit episodes. We have, if you haven't already, we have 3 really awesome episodes and a Christmas edition, a Merry Holy Shitmas, where you see scholar Dr. Robert Price, who might or might not actually be in a Santa hat. You got to watch it. It's up on Mythicist MKE at YouTube. Check it out. You'll love it. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. The Mythicist Milwaukee Show is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee, producer Sean Freisig, associate producer Fritz Blandone, engineer Jason Lawson, and hosts Brian Edward and Jacob Wolfel. Every week we produce a new broadcast that sheds light on religion, secularism, and mythology. If you enjoy this show, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicist. Closing theme, written and performed by Shelley Siegel.
There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom, beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility and ether to breathe. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they're all myths, but who will be the next to die? There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom, beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility and ether to breathe. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, but who will be the next to die? Okay, got it.